In my vlog on Shropshire Folklore of Mary Webb, I mentioned that Mary was heavily influenced by Charlotte Burne, and a jointly authored book, Shropshire Folklore, A Sheaf of Gleanings. I actually find that A Sheaf of Gleanings is ready available both from booksellers and online. So I've decided to begin a series based from the large and detailed book. Where I can, I'll augment it with additional materials. I think I also need to apologise that it'll mostly use still photography that I can find on the internet. As from Indonesia, I cannot find relevant video clips, and I'm most unlikely to return to the UK again. Charlotte Sophie Burne, or Lottie, 1850 to 1823. Charlotte was actually born just over the border in Staffordshire at Morton Vicarage. It's said that she inherited her interest in folklore from her mother, also called Charlotte Burne, but this time Charlotte Ann Burne, 1820 to 1893. Charlotte's father, Sambrook Thomas Higgins Burne, 1822 to 1861, was born into a wealthy Staffordshire family. He matriculated at Trinity College, Oxford, in 1841, but did not take a degree. But it would seem that he was disinherited by his father. He was assisted by his brother, the Reverend Thomas Burne, whom was the perpetual curate of Morton in Staffordshire. However, the family moved to Summerhill, Edgmond in Shropshire in 1854, having exhausted their welcome at the Morton Vicarage. And Lottie seems to make a big point of this, that she's finally living in Shropshire. But the truth is, all of these spaces I speak of are just running along the border of Shropshire and Staffordshire. They're very similar places, to be honest. Now, her father's said to have taken to shooting, hunting and drinking. In 1857 he was twice thrown from his horse, and as events surrounding it were somewhat taboo, it's fair to assume that he was drunk, but this led to his premature death in 1861. Lottie suffered a serious illness during her early years. Conditions of ill health and obesity would impede her physical well-being throughout her life. In 1875, Burne became friendly with Georgina Frederick Jackson, who was collecting material for a Shropshire workbook, 1879, and its companion work with the provisional title of Folklore Gleanings. Jackson's demise led Burne to take over her material, adding her own collection of tales to produce Shropshire Folklore, A Sheaf of Gleanings. This probably explains the claim that the book was jointly authored. In the 1890s, she resided at Pyburch, Eccleshall, again in Staffordshire, where she collaborated with the local folklorist and folk song collector Miss Alice Annie Keary of Stoke-on-Trent. Together they spent 3 years, around 1890 to 93, collecting material locally in North Staffordshire. While a number of joint papers were published, Burne moved to Cheltenham somewhere around 1894, and the project failed to be realised in a book form. She became the first female president of the Folklore Society, 1909 to 1911, and indeed was active in the Folklore Society for some 40 years. I began my last vlog on ghosts by saying that Shrewsbury in Shropshire may be the most haunted town and county in England. One of my reasons for believing this is that King James I and Matthew Hopkins, who I think in an earlier vlog I called him Martin Hopkins, I knew it was Matthew, I just misread it, appear to have had far less influence on Wales and the Marshes, and the persecution of witches is largely missing in Shropshire. Yes, I am convoluting witchcraft with the paranormal, a complex belief which this is not the time to fully describe. But at its heart is that our reality is shaped by what we believe. Therefore, the more prevalent is witchcraft, then therefore also are paranormal events. Of course, this makes no sense to materialist scientists, but then magic is everything that materialist science rejects. A walk around Shrewsbury or other towns like Ludlow, Bishop's Castle and Oswestry today will confirm the contemporary interest in witchcraft across the county. Personally, I have to doubt if these modern day witches would have much resonance with the cunning folk of old, despite their protests and claims. But again, that's another story. But what has struck me about Shropshire folklore is the degree to which they appear to point to a morality from an animistic past. Now, this is pure conjecture on my behalf, but it is somewhat informed conjecture. These have been incorporated into Christianity, and when looking at witchcraft, it's so difficult to escape the tendency of most religions to brand what they don't understand as satanic. I firmly believe witchcraft and the paranormal to be more common in the west of Shropshire than in the east. It's therefore interesting that Lottie has more stories from the east, especially of malevolent magic. I can only presume that in the west cunning folk were much more accepted, even a part of everyday life. Indeed, whilst I'm not convinced by distinctions of black and white magic, and again this requires a lengthy explanation and now is not the time, but it seems to me that magic is like war. Is there such a thing as a just war? Maybe not. But what about self-defence? Well, if you're like me, you would also be uneasy with the concept of self-defence. I come at this not from a moralistic, or not a communal moralistic at least, nor religious perspective. Indeed, magic is very much a part of the Islam that I practice in Java. But my own personal belief that we should seek to limit our impact on the environment and others. However, I do need to explain that Lottie almost exclusively focus on what others would describe as black magic. All too often hinted that it's connected to Satanism and that there is an internal fight between God and Satan. Now, if this is your belief, I have no intention of challenging it. All I want to say is, this has not been my experience, and believe me, much to my regret, regret, I have great experience of such matters. Few, if any, of those practising black magic actually believe in Satan, and therefore cannot be described as satanic. Indeed, my real experience is as being a victim, therefore my regret, of a Buddhist left-handed tantric path. And I have found Islam to be largely ineffective in removing its effects. This is all a very long-winded way of saying, whatever your views on witchcraft, it certainly does exist. And for a significant minority in Shropshire today, its effects are very real. And in the past, this minority was a majority. Indeed, globally, it would still be true for the vast majority of humanity. So if you are one who says, I don't believe in magic, it's not so much because you're educated and modern, but part of a minority that all too often practices a form of cultural imperialism, imposing your beliefs, or at least attempting to, on others. 1875, a public official of Oakengates claimed that an old man entered his office and asked him to write a letter. An elderly woman was very ill, also that his daughter had 2 children ill, and that he believed they were suffering from some form of witchcraft. The letter was to a wise and good woman in Wellington, and he asked her to put a stop to it. He believed that his pig was also bewitched. I find this interesting because as a child I would sneak outside a house in Arleston village near Wellington to spy on the home of a supposed witch. Also, Wellington is where the first witch ladder was discovered. Bessie Tomlinson of Edgmond, Marsh was for many years before her death afflicted by one of those long, lingering, mysterious diseases which are so commonly set down to the effects of witchcrafts. The doctors couldn't find anything wrong with her, but she knew very well what was the matter. Amongst the neighbours was one Challoner, also of Edgmond Marsh, who was believed to be a witch. Not long before she was taken ill, he asked her to lend him some money, but she refused, saying that she had none to lend, and she and her neighbours were quite convinced that this was the consequence. Challoner had put a spell on her and caused her strange illness. Such illnesses that are undiscoverable by doctors and explanations of sorcery are common today where I live in Java. Now I urge you not to dismiss them out of hand. You may well feel that they are all within the mind, and I would probably agree with you, but that does not make them unreal. Indeed, I often help villagers in Java suffering from a variety of illnesses and misfortune, lacking access to a health or legal system. There's absolutely nothing unusual in this. Perhaps what is unusual is that nobody ever pays me for my troubles, as the idea of paying a foreigner would be even more ridiculous than a dog speaking in Javanese. And normally some local herbs are enough to provide relief, but sometimes I have to remove possessions by ghosts or jinn. Whilst I do believe it to be in the mind, in order to remove them I have to convince myself that they're external, and it is this that seems to convince the patient that I have removed them, which indeed cures them. Challoner moved to Wolverhampton during the course of the poor woman's illness, but his power did not cease with his presence. He and his sister, who lived with him, were both reputed to be witches, but the brother was the worst. From what I can tell, this story was taken up by primitive Methodists at the time. I would therefore caution readers to be, as all too often such stories are embellished to support a particular interpretation of it. A family who went to live in Edgmond in 1854, in ignorance of Challoner, employed him to kill pigs for them, but a young woman who entered their service would never eat their bacon. After Challoner left the parish, he came begging to the door of the same family and the servants encouraged the master to do so. Not that they thought that he could hurt them exactly, but it was better to be on the safe side. Whilst traditionally the accusation of witchcraft was often brought against ladies of rank, since the 16th century the imputation has chiefly been confined to poor miserable old women. She was probably an eccentric and unpopular character. The Reverend W. Walsham Howe, Bishop of Bedford, was formerly rector of Whittington near Oswestry. In 1872 he wrote that after he came to Whittington in 1851, an old lady named Kitty Williams, who lived close to the rectory, fell ill. At the same time, Mrs. Walsham Howe had been ill for some time. At a small farmhouse in Babbins Wood, the farmer, speaking of his wife's illness, said she hoped we were very kind to Kitty Williams, because Kitty had the evil eye. and he thought that she probably was why his wife had fallen ill. When Kitty Williams was young, she lived with a family in the neighbourhood, but was sent away for misconduct. So she soon afterwards married. From the time she left service, everything went wrong. Cows dying, horses going lame, etc., etc. Locals consulted a wise woman who told them to get a pair of black horses with long tails and drive them through the country till they stopped of themselves. And when they did so, to give the first woman they saw whatever she asked for. They did get the horses and drove about till the horses stopped outside Kitty Williams' house, close to Whittington Rectory. Kitty came out and greeted the old servant and asked what present she would like. She said a shawl, so they drove to Oswestry and bought her one. And from that day all things prospered with them. It's interesting that Lottie mentions the evil eye a number of times, as this is something I associate more with Arab and Mediterranean countries, but it was clearly used in Shropshire in Lottie's time. In common with folklore stories to find horses become aware of the presence of evil spirits when man cannot discover them. Elsewhere too, the witches ride horses, whose stables are not protected by charms. Perhaps because black horses are especially subject to their power and thus recognise the mistress at once. Again, this resonates with my experience in Java, where animals seem to sense the paranormal before humans. Often chickens are kept, as they will take up a malevolent spell and die prior to their owners. A woman was going along a road with a child in her arms, which was eating an apple. Another woman, well known to the witch, came behind her and took the apple from the child's hand, bit a piece out of it and returned it. The child was fat and healthy till then, but from that day it never grew again, and pined away until it died. A woman from Dorley, who was a maker of pikelets, went to live in newly built house which belonged to a clergyman. Therefore one would think that it was free from witchcraft. In a very short time she gave notice to leave, declaring that the house was bewitched and she could not work in it. In June 1882 a man near Madeley-on-Severn, which I assume to be Madeley Telford to distinguish it from Madeley Staffordshire, found in a crevice one of the joints of the chimney a folded paper sealed with red wax, on which were written the following words: "I charge all witches and ghosts to depart from this house, in the great name of Jehovah, the Alpha and Omega." Old Mrs. Mansell, living in Limekill Bank at Longner, declared that she was bewitched. Something came creeping up on her every night as she was in bed, and nothing would stop it. She took to the Bible and prayer book with her to bed, and hymn books in the house too, but none of it was any good. The neighbour gave her a leaf out of the Bible for a charm, and she folded it and put it on her heart, but it did no good either. She then took a rolling pin and thrashed the bed right before she got into it, but it was no better than anything else had been. And when the last heard of, she continued to be bewitched. I was not wanting to challenge those with more dogmatic religious beliefs than my own. I have to say this is also my experience in Java. Although recitations of Al-Quran, especially Ayat al-Kursi, may help, often they do not. I believe this is because one needs to understand the nature of the malevolence, rather than seeing the scriptures as a universal cure, although maybe they can be effective in protection. In the 18th century, exorcisms and the use of clergy were much in evidence. The servant to Thomas Nunes of Horton near Wem took it upon his head to hide his master's plough and saddle, and claimed that they were conveyed away by witchcraft. His tale met with so much credence that he was encouraged to play other pranks, and at length he even set the house on fire. Mr. Hughes, curate of Wem from 1698 to 1708, and then again 1710 to 11, being desired to pray in a house that was disturbed after he'd done his office, called for his horse, whereupon the boy came running up to acquaint them that the parson's saddle had gone. Mr. Hughes was positive that the witch had no power over, if because he had honestly paid for it, and therefore caused a diligent search to be made for the saddle, which they found in a hayloft. This caused the boy to be very much suspected, and he was taken before the justices, and he confessed to his misdeeds, resulting in a whipping and an imprisonment. The people at a farm between Alverley and Quat once missed some turkeys and suspected a young man in the neighbourhood of the theft. So they went to an old woman in Kidderminster who judged it to be him. It was said that this woman could bring trouble on those who she judged guilty of any such crime by making them blind or lame. The young man's aunt at Kinlet, who was moreover convinced of his innocence, was very much concerned for him and consulted an old man called John Malpas on his behalf. Old John gave her a written copy of a verse from the Bible, which would ensure the lad's safety from witchcraft as long as he carried about him, and his cousin, then a little girl, took it to him one Sunday morning at the farm. Dick Spot the conjurer lived in Oswestry in the 18th century and obtained honour of a biography which may be found by the curious amongst pamphlets in the British Museum. His real name was Richard Morris, the name Spot being given to him on account of a black spot on his face. He was actually a Derbyshire man by birth and related both to Sir Richard Arkwright of the spinning gemming fame. He was an excellent mechanic and was believed to be able to find his way anywhere without direction. He was an orphan and brought up by his mother's sister, Deborah Heathcote, who was a fortune teller, by which means added to her independent income, but a nephew who surpassed her in that art. Among other things, he foretold of the murder of the King of Sweden in 1794, 4 months before it occurred. His own death at the age of 83 happened in Oswestry in the following year, and even here his prophetic powers were brought into play. There was heard a very extraordinary rapping against the wainscot of his room that he died in, and of which he seemed sensible but not affected by it. When his attendants asked if he'd heard the noise behind the wainscot, he finally answered, "Yes, and in a little while after," he said, "my countenance will be determined by the light of the lamp, which will go out before the morning," and which indeed happened. It would seem that Dick Spot was even more famous in North Wales. Indeed, there are many stories across North Wales of this very same Dick Spot. A conjurer living in Yardington near Whitchurch was a tinker by trade, and his magic powers were in great demand. In 1874, an old woman at Bletchley near Morton-Say lost some potatoes and also a pair of sheets, which she'd hung out in her garden to dry. She went to Whitchurch to consult a man about it. The tinker assured her that the potatoes were eaten, but that she would get the sheets back, and in a fortnight she found them hanging on the hedge off which they had been stolen. When he was consulted about the whereabouts of a young man who was missing, he replied that he was quite comfortable and with his friends. Shortly after, the poor fellow was found under the ice in a canal. Probably his shock took the public confidence in the conjurer. Conjurer or wizard who formerly lived at Yockleton. On one occasion, a woman whose husband had deserted her went to this man to try and get him back, or at least find out where he was. The man went through sort of ceremony or incantation, and it had hardly ended when a great black cat appeared on the outside windowsill and rubbed itself against the pane. Both the man and the woman ran for their lives. The method of divination which the conjurers used was an old favourite, one of the Bible and a key, only instead of the Bible he used an old book, The Life of Guy Earl of Warwick. This was a play using topical allusions and subject matter concerning Christian piety and cardinal virtues. Martha Cadd of Ludlow missed a sheet and proceeded to use the key on the Bible to discover who'd stolen it. She and a party of friends went to the backyard of several neighbours in succession, and had each of them opened the Bible, and the injured party crossed her forefingers over it. The key was balanced on the fingers, and the name of the person in the living house was mentioned. And Mrs. Cadd, who should have done so, could not read. Her neighbour, Mary Ann Collier, repeated for her the 16th verse of the first chapter of Ruth. The key remained motionless until they reached the yard belonging to Mrs. Elizabeth Oliver, when as soon as her name was mentioned, they declared that both the key and the Bible turned completely out of their hands. They then tried whether the theft was committed by daylight or dark, and the key turned to daylight. On the 27th of December, Miss Collier met Miss Oliver and informed her that she was a daylight thief. Miss Oliver charged her at the Ludlow Borough Sessions on the 8th of January 1879 with using abusive language, and the whole story came out in court, accompanied by a renowned wrangle between the pair and a great display of interest in part of the many believers in divination who were present, and one of whom, being called as a witness, averred that the mention of the thief's name, the key, invariably began to jerk about, and much to the astonishment of the mayor and his colleagues, who dismissed the case. An ancestor of mine was a mayor of Ludlow, but I have no idea if they were one and the same. Exactly the same thing just happened again. A Mrs. Caroline Pardo of Upper Golford in Ludlow lately lost a watch from a room in which her daughter had recently died and lain ill, and suspected a neighbour, Ellen Wall, who'd helped to nurse the sick child, of having stolen it. So she turned the key on the Bible, and when Mrs. Wall's name was called, it fell to the ground 10 times. She accused Mrs. Wall of the theft, and on February the 13th, 1883, later charged her at Ludlow Borough Sessions with having used abusive language to her on the proceedings of the 27th of January. Mr. Pardo, who gave the bench the benefit of her opinion on the subject at great length, took out a cross summons for the same offence against Mrs. Wall's son, for whom, having resorted to his mother's cause, and the matter ended with an infliction of a shilling fine on both parties. This divination technique was also known in Worthing. A young woman from the Market Drayton neighbourhood had actually made one of the party's 6 girls, who sat up until midnight one All Saints' Eve to discover which of them should be married first. Which of them took a shift and hung it on the back of the chair before the fire, and all waited in silence until the clock struck 12. Then repeated a charm with all our informant, which our informant unfortunately had forgotten. It had to be said very slowly to the last exact 10 minutes, and the girls whose shift moved first after the formula was completed would be the first to marry. Little Drayton, an old woman named Jane, or it could have been Jean Salvage, who had a reputation for witchcraft. The story goes that one harvest time, Jean and a neighbour's woman were busy leasing the churlish, when the churlish farmer in whose field they were came up and bade them to go away. From that hour neither man nor beast could work for him, and the harvest was all but at a standstill. For some days this strange deadlock continued, until at last the farmer sent for Jean and told her that she might lease as much as she liked. Then the spell with which she had bewitched him was removed. The Ambulers occupied a farm at Wilderley near Pulverbatch. In a little cottage in a neighbouring dale lived an old woman, commonly called Betty. She used to beg at the farmhouse and generally got what she asked for. One day Betty came on a usual errand and found the farmer's wife mixing some supping for the calves. She watched the good meal and milk stirred together over the fire, took fancy to it and begged for a share. Mrs. Ambler was rather vexed, spoke sharply and refused to give her any. Betty only had said in a meaning tone, "The calves want to eat the supping now." When the maid came out, the pail carefully prepared the supping to the calves. They utterly refused to touch it. 3 times over there was an attempt made to give it to them, but in vain. Then Betty's ominous words came to mind, and as quickly as might she was sent to the farm and desired to bless the calves. "Me bless your calves," she said. "What have I to do with your calves?" But at last she yielded and said, "My God, bless your calves." But they still refused to eat, and then Mrs. Ambler begged her to leave without the word "my." After much pressure she gave way and consented to repeat the simple words, "God bless the calves." Mrs. Ambler then herself took out the supping to the hungry calves, and to her delight they came to meet her at the door of their house and ate their food with a hearty appetite. There was an old witch named Pris Morris who lived at Clebury North. She had a grudge against one of the farmers of the place because he had stopped her from leasing in his field. One day, not long after, his waggoner was going along the road with the waggon and horses, and suddenly the horse stopped short, right opposite the witch's house. It was a good road and a level road, but there was nothing to hinder them. But there they stopped and stood still. The waggoner shouted at them and took his whip and thrashed them, but they did not move. The master came out and took the lad's whip and flogged the poor horse, worse than ever, but it was no use. Then when he got to the woman's house with the whip in his hand and knocks at the door with the whip handle, and old Pris Morris comes out, to which Pris explained that she'd done nothing to his horse, and that, "Pray God bless you and your horse, or I'll flog you till you canna stand." And the horse started off again that very minute and took the load straight home. A farmer at Child's Arkle in northeast Shropshire was noted for having the evil eye and for having dealings with the devil. He could, it was believed, make people who displeased him go in a direction exactly as he wished. One day a party of Morris dancers called at the village inn where our hero happened to be sitting. After going through the performance, one of the dancers snatched up the horn of ale which stood before the farmer and emptied it at a draught. The farmer merely cast a glance on the impertinent youth, and soon after the dancers left the house. They'd not gone far when the ale drinker was brought to a standstill. The others laughed at him for his fate. He strove to follow them, but in vain. He was rooted to the spot, and when at length he could move again, it was only to retrace his steps to the presence of the man who he had fronted, and whom he did not let go until the following morning. Now I do need to sound a warning against the use of the evil eye and witchcraft, however tempted you may be to stop Morris dancers from dancing. An old witch is said to have inhabited Bridgenorth Castle, or probably more likely one of the rock dwellings in the cliff below it. And she used to shapeshift into animals. The dogs would run her but never caught her. Another cave-dwelling woman who expressed disbelief in witchcraft described how a child was taken to see her father's cousin in Tittensaw Clee. The young woman, a young woman who was wasted away till she was merely skin and bones from the spells of an old witch. The girl's friends besought the old woman to take it off her, but she never would do so, and the girl at last pined away and died. In the same cliff as the Hermitage is a third and very much smaller cave called the Witch's Cave. Tradition tells that there lived a witch who brought horse and wagons to a standstill when they reached that part of what is a very steep road, which was opposite her cave. Out of the hall, we are told, the old hag fled every night on a broomstick, and we cannot help fancying her adjoining her opposite neighbour in the meadows by the Severn side. A Hagmore End may be the site of the meeting place of Shropshire witches, although I can find no trace of a Hagmore End in Shropshire. But there are hagstones at Hillmore in neighbouring Cheshire. On the longest night, all of the ghosts in Shropshire and counties beyond meet on the highest point of the Stiperstones, the Devil's Chair, to choose their king. Nanny Morgan was a bad old woman. In Nanny's girlhood, she was concerned in a robbery at the house of Mrs. Powell at Burne near Wenlock, together with Mary Beaumont, a servant of the house. The clothes which were stolen were found in Nanny's possession, and both were tried for the offence at Shrewsbury Assizes and found guilty. Mary Beaumont was transported, but it is said that Nanny escaped with imprisonment. After she came out of jail, Nanny joined a party of gypsies, from whom she learned to tell fortunes with cards, and settled on Westwood Common. She was consulted by servant girls for miles around. After her death, a quantity of jewellery was found in her house, obtained from her customers in payment for her services, along with many letters with signatures of ladies of education and position in the neighbourhood. She was supposed to practice witchcraft and to have the evil eye. By the end of her life, the witch had become Anne Williams, alias Morgan, alias Evans, Mary Beaumont, one of the children of Betty Beaumont, who is remembered as the last person who did penance in a white sheet at Wenlock. At 69, Nanny Morgan came to a shocking end. On the 12th of September 1857, she was found lying dead in her house, stabbed on the face and neck and wrist, and she just lay. No one was found to pay for a funeral of the detested witch, and not even her shoes were removed from her corpse. On the day of her death, a young man who had lodged with her was seen leaving the house with blood on his clothes. He was arrested and tried for murder at the Spring Assizes. It appeared that the old woman had a violent affection for him, and that he was completely under her influence. It was known that he had often wished to escape the spell which she held him with, but he believed that he could by art's force him to return to her wherever he might be, and he dreaded her spells too much to break free. One day in question he'd been at her house, and on return she was angered by his absence, gave way to her ungoverned temper, and greeted him with a storm of abusive taunts. Maddened with rage and fear, he stabbed her recklessly and repeatedly, not with any thought of murder, but simply to free himself from the witch's power, and then fled the cottage. He was, however, condemned to death by many of the jury of the county magistrates, petitioned for a commutation of the sentence, and it was not carried into effect. In fact, I've actually found this story reported in newspapers of the day, so it goes to show that witchcraft was indeed practised by many in Shropshire of old.